In the hallowed halls of American justice, some silences are heavier than others. This was a silence of consequence, the kind that feels like the air being sucked out of history itself. The United States Court of Appeals was a cathedral of law, its polished wood gleaming under solemn lights, its air thick with the ghosts of landmark decisions. On the bench sat Judge Thomas, a figure less of flesh and blood and more of judicial granite, a man whose rare words carried the weight of an empire. His gaze, a weapon of conservative fury, scanned the gallery and locked onto its target. There, sitting in the front row, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She was not there to argue a case, but her very presence was an argument, an island of defiant composure in a sea of starched collars and nervous whispers. For months, she had been a vocal critic of the court's direction, her voice echoing in the halls of Congress, a constant, sharp reminder of the world outside this marble chamber. The judge saw not a legislator, but a heretic in his church. In a breathtaking breach of judicial protocol, he leaned into his microphone. The low hum of the courtroom vanished. Reporters froze, their pens hovering over notepads. This wasn't law, this was personal. His voice, a low and deliberate rumble, dripped with a condescension years in the making. He didn't address her counsel. He addressed her directly, as if she were a lone defendant in the court of his personal opinion. He spoke of decorum, of respect for institutions, his words a thin veil for raw, political animosity. The gavel didn't just fall, it crashed like a thunderclap, a sound designed to shatter confidence and command obedience. In the ringing silence that followed, Judge Thomas uttered 9 words that would ignite a firestorm and leave a nation speechless. "I find you in contempt. $500 million. $500 million. The sum was so absurd, so fantastically unmoored from any legal reality, that for a moment it didn't register. It was a number from a fantasy, a tyrant's ransom. Then the shockwave hit. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Lawyers exchanged bewildered glances, their faces a mask of disbelief. This was not law. This was a public execution of credibility, and the weapon was a gavel. The judge remained motionless, his face an unreadable portrait of immense satisfaction, as if he had just corrected a great imbalance in the universe. But this was no random act of judicial rage. It was a meticulously laid trap, and its origins lay in the very case being argued that day. The case, known as Texas Voters Alliance v. the State, was a brutal battlefront in the war for the future of the American vote. At its heart was a controversial state law designed to purge voter rolls, close polling stations in minority neighborhoods, and impose draconian ID requirements. It was a law Jasmine Crockett had fought tooth and nail, a law she had branded in Congress as a revival of Jim Crow in a 3-piece suit. Her presence in the court was not a courtesy call, it was a silent, powerful protest. She was there to bear witness, to represent the millions of voices the law was engineered to silence. She was the living embodiment of the opposition, and to Judge Thomas, she was a foreign agent in his sovereign territory. He saw her presence as a contamination of his sacred space. He believed she had come to intimidate the court, to leverage her political celebrity and poison the well of pure legal reason, and so he had prepared his response. The fine wasn't an outburst. It was an ambush. It was a strategic move designed to shatter her image, to reframe her in the public eye not as a champion of the people, but as a disruptive radical who held the nation's most sacred institutions in contempt. He wanted to dominate the news cycle, to create a narrative of a runaway legislator being brought to heel by a stoic, brave judge. He sought to humiliate her, to break her spirit, and to send a chilling message to anyone else who dared challenge the court's authority. This wasn't just a fine, it was a declaration of war. A war between a branch of government that sees itself as untouchable and a new generation of leaders who believe that no power should be absolute. The judge believed he had checkmated the fiery Congresswoman from Texas, using the full weight of his office to crush her under a mountain of imaginary debt and public shame. But he had made a fatal error, the classic blunder of the arrogant and the insulated. He had judged the book by its cover, assuming her passion was merely noise, not the righteous fire of a warrior. He had no idea that Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to observe a fight, she had come prepared to win one. And what she did next wasn't just a response. It was a lesson that would echo from the courtroom to the White House. To understand the eruption in that courtroom, you have to understand the volcano that had been dormant for decades. You have to understand the man behind the robe. How does a public servant become so powerful, so insulated, that he believes he can conjure a $500 million penalty out of thin air? The story of Judge Thomas is not just a story of law. It is a story of grievance, isolation, and the corrupting nature of absolute power. His journey to the nation's highest court was a trial by fire, a brutal and public spectacle that would forever shape his worldview. He emerged not humbled, but hardened, convinced that he was a martyr for a cause, and that his enemies were not just political opponents, but enemies of civilization itself. He retreated behind a wall of stoic silence, a silence that Washington, D.C. would mistake for wisdom for nearly 30 years. For decades, he was the court's great enigma. While other justices wrote books, gave speeches, and engaged in the public square, he remained a sphinx, his thoughts a closely guarded fortress. This silence became his brand, his armor. It cultivated an aura of immense, untouchable gravity. In a city of endless noise, his quiet was a source of immense power. His allies called it discipline. His detractors called it arrogance. The truth is, it was a strategy. By rarely speaking, he ensured that when he did, his words landed with the force of Scripture. He wasn't participating in a conversation. He was delivering a verdict from on high. His judicial philosophy, a rigid adherence to the past, became a tool to legitimize this detachment. He wasn't interpreting the law, he claimed. He was merely channeling the ghosts of the founders, acting as a humble vessel for a truth already written in stone. But behind this carefully constructed facade of monastic devotion to the law, another life was being lived, a life far removed from the struggles of the people his rulings would affect. A life of undisclosed luxury junkets on private jets, of lavish vacations funded by billionaire patrons, of moving in circles of unimaginable wealth and influence. This was not the life of a humble public servant, but of a modern-day aristocrat. He had become utterly detached from the nation he was meant to serve, living in a gilded echo chamber where his every opinion was validated and his every comfort was provided. The rules, it seemed, were for the little people. The gritty reality of America, the single mother struggling to find childcare, the student drowning in debt, the family facing eviction, these were abstract concepts, footnotes in a legal brief, not the lived experiences of his fellow citizens. This profound isolation bred a deep and festering resentment for the changing world outside his bubble, a world that was louder, more diverse, and less willing to show deference to the old guards of power. And in Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, he saw the personification of this new America. She was everything he was not. She was a fighter from a tough district, her voice honed not in Ivy League debating societies, but in the trenches of public defense. She was a woman, a minority, a relentless voice for the very people his philosophy often left behind. He saw her not as a duly elected representative of the American people, but as an interloper, a noisy intruder in his sacred temple. Her passion he mistook for insolence. Her advocacy he saw as an attack. For decades, his silence was mistaken for wisdom, his rulings seen as scripture by his followers. But behind the black robe was a man convinced of his own infallibility, a man who believed the law was not a shield for the people, but a sword for the powerful. And in Jasmine Crockett, he saw a threat to everything his power stood for. His unprecedented attack wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was the desperate roar of a man terrified of losing his grip on a world he no longer understood. Every legend has an origin story. And while one man was being forged in the marble halls of Washington, secluded from the people and surrounded by power, a warrior was being forged in the sun-baked courtrooms of East Texas. Jasmine Crockett's journey was not one of privilege or patronage. It was a journey paved with grit, fueled by a righteous anger at injustice, and defined by one simple principle: you don't back down. You never back down. Her story begins not in a corporate law firm or a prestigious clerkship, but in the trenches, in the places where the American dream goes to die. She chose to become a public defender. For those who don't know, being a public defender is one of the most thankless, grueling, and essential jobs in our legal system. It is to choose to stand with the forgotten, the poor, the accused, and the demonized. It is to be underpaid, overworked, and overwhelmed by a system that is designed to crush the very people you are sworn to protect. This was her crucible. Day after day, she stood as the last line of defense between a human being and the crushing machinery of the state. She saw firsthand how the system grinds down the powerless. She saw how a lack of money could mean a lifetime behind bars. She learned that justice is not some abstract concept discussed in a quiet chamber. It is a bare-knuckle brawl fought every single day in loud, chaotic courtrooms against impossible odds. This experience didn't make her cynical. It made her a fighter. It sharpened her voice into a precision instrument against hypocrisy and injustice. It taught her how to dismantle an opponent's argument, not with flowery rhetoric, but with cold, hard facts. She learned to read a room, to see the weakness in a powerful man's eyes, and to speak a truth so clear and so plain that it could not be ignored. After years in the trenches of criminal defense, she took her fight to the next level, becoming a civil rights attorney. She was no longer just defending individuals from the system. She was attacking the system itself. Her primary target? The very same kind of voter suppression laws that were at the heart of the case before Judge Thomas. This wasn't a new battle for her. She had been fighting this war her entire life, on the dusty backroads of Texas, taking on the powerful political machines that sought to disenfranchise Black and brown communities. Her transition to politics was not a career change. It was an escalation. She ran for office because she was tired of fighting unjust laws from the outside. She wanted a seat at the table where the laws were written. From the Texas State House to the United States Congress, she brought the same unapologetic, fearless energy that had defined her legal career. She refused to adopt the soft, poll-tested language of Washington. Her questions in committee hearings were like a surgeon's scalpel, precise, cutting, and aimed at revealing the truth. She became a voice for the voiceless, a champion for the people who, like her former clients, felt invisible to the powerful men who ran the country. And so, when she sat in that courtroom, listening to the condescending lecture of Judge Thomas, she was not intimidated. She was home. This was her battlefield. The judge, in his insulated world of billionaire patrons and lifetime appointments, saw a freshman congresswoman to be disciplined. He saw a nuisance. He failed to see the truth. Every battle she had ever fought, in the dusty courtrooms of Bowie County, on the floor of the Texas legislature, in the halls of Congress, had been leading to this single moment. Judge Thomas saw a disruptive politician. He failed to see the battle-hardened warrior standing before him, forged in the fires of injustice and ready to speak truth to power, no matter the cost. The $500 million decree hung in the air, a monument to judicial arrogance. In that moment, Judge Thomas expected one of two things: a collapse into tears or an eruption of rage. He had built his career on the assumption that power, when applied with overwhelming force, produces submission. He waited for the flinch, the gasp, the stammering protest that would prove his dominance. He received nothing. Jasmine Crockett did not move. She did not weep. She did not shout. She simply held his gaze, her expression not one of fear, but of profound analytical calm. It was the calm of a bomb technician studying a device, of a grandmaster seeing the entire board. This unnerving stillness was not the reaction he had planned for, and a flicker of irritation crossed his face. His trap had been sprung, but the target refused to be ensnared. So he escalated. Believing his authority was being questioned by her silence, he doubled down, launching into a prepared lecture. It was a masterpiece of condescension, a rambling monologue filled with intricate legal jargon and veiled insults, all delivered under the guise of a lesson in civics. He spoke of the majesty of the law, the sanctity of the courtroom, and the solemn duty to respect institutions, his voice swelling with theatrical indignation. It was a performance for the ages, the powerful man scolding the impertinent woman, the wise elder correcting the reckless youth. With every word he sought to shrink her, to reduce her to a chastened student in his personal classroom. The other judges on the panel shifted uncomfortably, their faces stony masks that barely concealed their embarrassment. This was no longer a hearing. It was a personal vendetta unfolding on a federal stage, but the more he spoke, the more power he lost. His escalating anger was a stark contrast to her unshakable composure. She let him talk. She let him reveal himself to the world, his fury an admission of his own insecurity. She knew this was not about the law. It was about control. It was the desperate tantrum of a man from a bygone era, confronted by a future he could not command. Her silence was a mirror, reflecting his own ugliness back at him, and the reflection was making him unravel. The reporters in the gallery knew what they were witnessing. They were no longer reporting on a voting rights case. They were documenting the meltdown of one of the most powerful jurists in the nation. The narrative was slipping from his grasp with every self-righteous word he uttered. Finally, his tirade sputtered to a halt. He was breathless, his face flushed. Convinced that his verbal barrage must surely have done the job, that he had finally crushed her will, he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to the bailiff standing by the door, a silent command to remove her from his sight. The bailiff took a hesitant step forward. This was it. The public humiliation was to be made complete with a physical expulsion. The judge's victory seemed absolute. But then, a single, quiet sound cut through the tense atmosphere. A simple clearing of the throat. It wasn't loud, but it seized the attention of the entire room. Jasmine Crockett leaned slightly toward her microphone. The bailiff stopped. The judge's smug expression faltered. And then she spoke. Her voice was not loud, it was not angry, but it was perfectly, devastatingly clear. "Judge," she began, her words echoing in the sudden, perfect silence, "with all due respect, you have made a grave miscalculation." It was as if a spell had been broken. The oppressive atmosphere of fear and deference evaporated, replaced by a silence of pure, electric anticipation. The judge, who had been a monolith of authority just moments before, now seemed frozen, a man caught completely off guard by a move he never anticipated. For the first time all day, he was not in control. Jasmine Crockett did not address the absurd fine. She did not argue its merits or plead for its removal. To do so would have been to legitimize an act of pure madness. Instead, she began to teach a class. Her voice, still calm and measured, took on the cadence of a professor, or more accurately, the public defender she had once been, patiently explaining the law to a hostile jury. "Judge," she started, her eyes locked on his, "I believe a brief review of Article 1 of the United States Constitution may be in order. It is Congress, not the judiciary, that holds the power to discipline its own members. Furthermore, the concept of contempt of Congress is a power wielded by the legislative branch to compel testimony or punish obstruction of its duties. It is not, and has never been, a free-floating charge that a member of the judiciary can levy against a legislator for disagreeing with them in public. What you have done here today is not enforce the law. You have invented a legal fantasy to silence a political opponent. In this chamber, you have the authority to interpret the law. You do not have the authority to rewrite the Constitution to soothe your own bruised ego. A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. The sheer audacity, the cold, hard truth of her statement was stunning. She paused, letting the words hang in the air before continuing to her next point, her voice gaining strength. This brings me to my second point, Judge, the separation of powers, a principle I'm sure you have written about extensively. This is not just a procedural error, it is a fundamental assault on the architecture of our democracy. For one branch of government to unilaterally declare a member of another branch in contempt and issue a punitive fine is the very definition of tyranny. It is the action of a king, not a judge. You sit there and lecture me on respect for institutions, but your actions today show a profound contempt for the most important institution of all, the constitutional order you swore an oath to protect and defend. The judge's face was now a thundercloud of fury. He opened his mouth to speak, to perhaps bang the gavel again, but Crockett was not finished. She delivered the final devastating blow. In your own widely praised 2008 opinion in Albright verse, the FCC, you yourself wrote, and I quote, "The judiciary is at its most dangerous when it mistakes its own political preferences for constitutional law. Judicial restraint is not a suggestion. It is a sacred duty, a bulwark against the encroachment of judicial monarchy." A sacred duty, Judge. Those were your words. You built your entire career on the image of a restrained, humble interpreter of the law. But today, you have set fire to that legacy. You have become the very judicial monarch you once warned us against. It was a masterstroke. She had taken his own intellectual armor and shattered it into 1,000 pieces. The room was deathly quiet. The judge looked utterly defeated, a man exposed. Finally, Crockett's voice softened, but it lost none of its power. This was no longer about the law, it was about the oath. "I took an oath, Judge. My oath is not to you, or to this court. My oath is to the Constitution, and to the 700,000 people in the 30th District of Texas who sent me to Washington to be their voice. They sent me there to fight for their right to vote, the very right this case seeks to diminish, and I will not be silenced. Not by you, not by your imaginary fine, not by anyone." She leaned back from the microphone, her work complete. Her final words were not for him, but for everyone. For the record, for history. This chamber, this robe, this gavel, they are symbols of a power you borrow. It is loaned to you by the people, and it is meant to serve them. It is not yours to keep. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a battle won, of a giant toppled. Judge Thomas did not speak. He had no words left. In that moment, he was no longer a powerful jurist. He was just a man, small and defeated, swallowed by a black robe that now looked less like a mantle of authority and more like a shroud. The battle in the courtroom was over, but the war for the narrative was just beginning. Before the defeated judge could even officially adjourn the session, the doors of the gallery flew open. It was a stampede. Reporters, their faces alight with the thrill of a career-defining story, scrambled for the exits, fumbling for their phones. They weren't just filing a report, they were lighting a fuse. The silence inside the chamber was immediately replaced by a deafening roar that was erupting all across the nation. The verdict of the people was coming, and it would be delivered at the speed of light. Within minutes, the internet was a wildfire. The first shaky cell phone videos of the exchange appeared, and the world stopped to watch. Hashtags began to trend, first by the thousands, then by the millions. Crockett's Constitution class went viral, followed by the more pointed gavel grievance. But the one that truly captured the moment was the simplest: Jasmine stands. It became a global rallying cry. The digital world rendered its judgment with a torrent of creativity. Memes flooded every platform. Crockett depicted as Wonder Woman deflecting bullets with her bracelets, as a Jedi Master facing down the Emperor, as a professor schooling a petulant child. In stark contrast, Judge Thomas was portrayed as a cartoon king, stomping his feet, his gavel shrinking in every frame until it was a tiny toy. It was more than mockery. It was a cultural exorcism, a collective rejection of his brand of authoritarian anger. The cable news networks, caught flat-footed, scrambled to catch up. On one channel, a conservative pundit, visibly flustered, attempted to defend the judge's intentions while condemning his methods, a verbal tap dance that convinced no one. On another, a liberal commentator was nearly moved to tears, calling it the most powerful defense of democracy she had ever witnessed on live television. Legal analysts were brought in, and one after another, they soberly confirmed what everyone already knew. The judge's actions had no basis in law. They used words like unconstitutional, shocking, and a profound abuse of power. They weren't just validating Crockett's argument. They were validating the outrage of millions of viewers. Back in Washington, the political establishment was thrown into chaos. Statements of support for Crockett poured in from across the Democratic Party, hailing her as a titan and a lioness of the Constitution. More telling was the silence from the other side. Republicans, who might normally leap to the defense of a conservative judge, were nowhere to be found. They knew a losing battle when they saw one. To defend the judge's actions would be political suicide. His personal crusade had left him on an island, completely abandoned. The story transcended partisan politics. It became a national lesson. High school civics teachers shared the video in their classrooms. Parents showed it to their children as an example of what it means to stand up to a bully. Jasmine Crockett's stand wasn't just a viral moment. It had become a piece of living history, a testament to the enduring power of speaking truth to power. Before the sun had set, the court of public opinion had reached a unanimous verdict. Judge Thomas had tried to make an example of Jasmine Crockett, but the people had made an icon of her and a pariah of him. The official fight was over, but her cultural victory was just getting started. Hours later, as the sun began to set, Jasmine Crockett emerged onto the courthouse steps. The scene was a chaotic sea of cameras and microphones, a stark contrast to the cold, controlled tension of the courtroom. But this time, the energy was not one of conflict, but of celebration. The world was waiting for a victory lap, for a triumphant speech savaging her defeated opponent. They would get something far more powerful. She stepped to the podium, and a hush fell over the crowd. She did not look angry or triumphant. She looked like a public servant who had just finished a long day at work. Her first words were not about the judge, but about the people. "Today," she began, her voice steady and clear, "a lot of noise was made in that building behind me. A lot of anger was directed my way, but I need to be clear. That was a distraction. The theatrics, the lectures, the impossible numbers pulled from thin air, none of that is real. It's a sideshow designed to make us forget what's truly at stake." She dismissed the $500 million fine with a simple wave of her hand. That outburst was not a legal ruling. It was a cry for help. A cry from a bygone era of power that is terrified of the future, terrified of accountability, and terrified of voices like yours and mine. She had done it again. She refused to play his game, refused to be his victim. She had reframed the entire event, not as a personal attack, but as a teachable moment for the country. And as she spoke, the networks carried her words live across the nation. Somewhere, in a quiet office, insulated from the cheering crowds, the judge was surely watching. He was witnessing his authority, an authority he had spent a lifetime building, being dismantled on live television, not with anger, but with a calm, unshakable dignity. He was watching a woman he tried to crush being hailed as a national hero. And it is here that the true meaning of the day became clear. His tears, if they fell, were not tears of remorse. They were the hot, bitter tears of impotent fury, the tears of a king who had been told once and for all that his crown was imaginary and his power was gone. He had tried to break her, but in the end, her response had broken him. Crockett's speech then soared beyond the events of the day into something universal and timeless. "True strength," she said, her voice resonating with the passion of 1,000 battles fought in obscurity, "is not found in a gavel or a black robe. It is not the power to silence others. True strength is found in the courage to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. It is the strength of the public defender who stands by her client when the whole world has turned against them. It is the strength of the community organizer who registers voters in the face of intimidation. It is the strength of every American who gets up every day and fights for a more perfect union." She told the world that this was never about money. It was about a principle. That in America, power is loaned by the people, not owned by the powerful, and when it is abused, it is the duty of the people to reclaim it. The judge may have had a gavel, but she, and the millions she spoke for, had a voice. And on this day, her voice was mightier than his gavel. A judge tried to slap Jasmine Crockett with a $500 million fine in a breathtaking display of personal animosity. But her response, a masterclass in dignity, constitutional law, and unwavering courage, brought his towering arrogance to a tearful, humiliating end. Her victory was a powerful reminder that in the great American story, the loudest voice does not always win. True power is not the ability to issue commands from a high bench. It is the strength to stand firm on your principles, to know your rights, and to speak for the people who entrusted you with their hopes. What happened in that courtroom was more than just a viral moment. It was a lesson that the armor of a black robe is no match for the sword of truth. A lesson that arrogance is a brittle foundation, easily shattered by the force of quiet conviction. Jasmine Crockett's voice did not just fill a courtroom. It created an echo that reminds us that our institutions are only as strong as the integrity of the people who lead them, and that it is the sacred duty of every citizen to hold them accountable. This channel is dedicated to telling the stories of those who, like her, refuse to be silenced. We believe that courage is contagious and that these moments of profound moral clarity deserve to be seen, shared, and celebrated. If you believe that one voice, speaking with truth and conviction, can still change the world, then help us amplify that voice. Subscribe to be part of this community and share this story so that the echo of that day continues to spread. Be part of the echo.